The business card was crumpled and stained with tears when they found it in Tommy Chen's bedroom 3 weeks later. His mother held it with shaking hands, reading the name she'd forbidden him to call. Ozzy Osbourne's manager, the same card that had promised to change everything. But here's what nobody knew. What the 50 million people who watched the video never saw. What the news crews and music blogs and industry vultures all missed completely. Tommy Chen wasn't crying because his dream had died. He was crying because it had lived. And sometimes, when you're 12 years old and the whole world is watching, survival looks a lot different than success. See, everyone thought they knew this story. Kid meets rock star. Rock star changes kid's life. Feel-good ending. Roll credits. But that's not what happened on Hollywood Boulevard that July afternoon in 2005. What really happened was darker, messier, and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. This is about the moment when the Prince of Darkness looked into the eyes of a struggling kid and saw something that terrified him, his own reflection. And what Ozzy Osbourne did next would either save Tommy Chen's life or destroy it completely. The truth is, fame doesn't always rescue you. Sometimes it devours you. And the greatest act of love isn't giving someone everything they want. It's protecting them from what they think they need. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why Tommy Chen keeps that crumpled business card in his wallet to this day. And why, every July 15th, he returns to the same corner where his life exploded into a million pieces, carrying a secret that could change how we think about dreams, sacrifice, and what it really means to save someone. Tommy Chen's fingers were bleeding again. He'd been practicing for 6 hours straight in the cramped bedroom he shared with his 8-year-old sister, headphones clamped over his ears, trying to master the intricate fingering that made Randy Rhoads a legend. The calluses hadn't formed yet. They never had time to. Every day brought new songs to learn, new techniques to perfect, new reasons to push harder. What his parents didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Tommy wasn't just chasing a dream anymore. He was running from a nightmare. 3 weeks earlier, his father had been laid off from the restaurant where he'd worked double shifts for 8 years. The family had exactly 47 days before they'd lose their small apartment in Koreatown. Tommy's Saturday street performances, the ones his parents thought were just a kid's hobby, were now bringing in 40% of their household income. No pressure at all. Tommy wrapped a Band-Aid around his index finger and checked the clock. 4:47 a.m. His parents would be awake soon, getting ready for another day of job hunting and pretending everything was fine. His sister would ask again why Daddy seemed sad all the time. And Tommy would grab his beat-up Stratocaster knockoff and head to school, where nobody knew that the kid who aced every math test was slowly drowning. But there was something else. Something Tommy hadn't told anyone, not even his best friend Marcus, who knew about the family's money troubles. 2 months ago, Mrs. Rodriguez from the music department had pulled him aside after class. There was a spot opening at the Los Angeles Youth Conservatory. Full scholarship. The kind of program that turned talented kids into professional musicians. The kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime. The application fee was $300. They needed it by August 1st. Tommy had been saving every penny from his street performances, hiding crumpled bills in an old shoebox under his bed. So far, he had $87. At this rate, he'd have enough money roughly 3 weeks after the deadline passed. This is why he'd been obsessing over Crazy Train. Not because it was his favorite song, though it was, but because it was his grandfather's favorite song. And his grandfather, who died when Tommy was 9, had been the only adult who'd ever looked at him and said, "You're going to be something special, Tommy. I can feel it." His grandfather had been a musician, too, back in Korea. Never famous, never successful by most people's standards, but he'd understood something about music that Tommy was just beginning to grasp. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having the best equipment or the most expensive lessons. It was about finding that place inside yourself where the music lived and letting it speak for you when words weren't enough. "Play from your heart," his grandfather had whispered during one of their last conversations. "And maybe someone will hear it." Tommy had made his grandfather a promise that night. Someday he'd play Crazy Train so perfectly that even Ozzy Osbourne himself would stop to listen. It was a kid's promise, the kind of impossible dream that makes adults smile sadly and change the subject. But Tommy meant every word. Now, sitting on his bed at dawn, staring at his bleeding fingertips, Tommy made a decision that would change everything. He was going to nail Crazy Train this Saturday. He was going to play it with so much passion, so much raw emotion, that everyone who heard it would remember why they fell in love with music in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, he'd make enough money to submit that application. What Tommy didn't know was that 40 miles away in Malibu, Ozzy Osbourne was having the worst week of his professional life. The recording sessions for his new album were a disaster. His label was losing patience. His management company was fielding calls from promoters who were canceling tour dates. At 56 years old, the Prince of Darkness was facing the possibility that his career, his identity, might be over. Ozzy had been where Tommy was now, a working-class kid with impossible dreams and no money to make them real. The difference was, Ozzy had clawed his way to the top by making deals with devils who wore expensive suits and spoke in contract language. He'd gotten everything he'd ever wanted. And it had almost killed him. Saturday morning arrived gray and muggy, typical Lowe's Angels summer weather that made everyone irritable and impatient. Tommy packed his gear, the scratched guitar, the buzzing amp, the folding chair that had one wobbly leg, and took the bus to Hollywood Boulevard. He'd been performing at the same corner for 3 months now, long enough to recognize the regulars. There was Maria, the woman who sold flowers and always dropped $1 in his case, the tourists with their cameras and guidebooks, the other street performers who'd nod respectfully when he set up his equipment. But today felt different, charged somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. Tommy tuned his guitar carefully, checking each string twice. The E was still giving him trouble, that loose tuning peg that never stayed tight, but he'd learned to work around it. He positioned his small amp so the buzz wouldn't be too noticeable. He opened his guitar case and placed it strategically where people could see it but wouldn't trip over it. Everything had to be perfect. His family's future might depend on it. As he began to play, warming up with some basic chord progressions, Tommy thought about his grandfather's words. Play from your heart. Let someone hear it. The morning crowd was thin, mostly commuters hurrying to work, their minds already occupied with meetings and deadlines. But Tommy played anyway, because this wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about the conservatory application. This was about keeping a promise to a dead man. This was about proving that a 12-year-old kid with a beat-up guitar and 47 days until eviction still had something worth saying. He closed his eyes and began the opening riff to Crazy Train. Tommy had no idea that in exactly 12 minutes, a black Mercedes with tinted windows would pull up to the curb. He had no idea that the man inside had been driving aimlessly for hours, running from his own demons, when those familiar notes would cut through his despair like a perfectly tuned blade. Most importantly, Tommy had no idea that the person who was about to change his life forever was fighting the exact same battle he was, just from the other side of fame's double-edged sword. The clock on the bank across the street read 10:23 a.m. when Tommy hit the first note. By 10:35, everything he thought he knew about dreams and destiny would be shattered and rebuilt in ways that would haunt both him and Ozzy Osbourne for years to come. At 10:24 a.m., Ozzy Osbourne was contemplating suicide. Not the dramatic rock star kind that makes headlines and sells records. The quiet, desperate kind that happens when you realize you've become a prisoner in your own life. He'd been driving the Pacific Coast Highway for 3 hours, his driver silent in the front seat, while Ozzy stared at the contract in his lap that would end everything he'd spent 30 years building. But what drove him to that Hollywood Boulevard corner wasn't destiny or fate or any of the mystical bullshit people would later claim. It was rage. Pure, burning rage at the 16-year-old kid who just destroyed his career with 3 words in a boardroom. He's too old. That's what Sharon's nephew had said during the emergency label meeting that morning. The kid barely old enough to shave, sitting in a chair that cost more than most people made in a month, deciding whether the Prince of Darkness deserved to keep making music. Heavy metal is dead, the kid had continued, scrolling through his phone while Ozzy's entire future hung in the balance. Our demographic wants hip-hop now, pop-punk maybe, but this, he gestured dismissively at Ozzy's demo tracks. This is for old people. Ozzy had wanted to grab the little bastard by his designer collar and show him exactly how alive heavy metal could be. Instead, he'd walked out. Because at 56, with 3 failed rehab attempts and a liver that looked like Swiss cheese, fighting teenagers wasn't going to save his career. Nothing was. That's when Tommy's guitar cut through his despair like a blade through silk. Ozzy had heard Crazy Train performed thousands of times. By cover bands, by tribute acts, by drunk fans at meet and greets who thought they could impress him. But this was different. This was a 12-year-old kid playing his song with the same desperate hunger that had driven Ozzy out of Birmingham's working-class hell 40 years ago. The kid was good, really good, but that wasn't what made Ozzy tell his driver to pull over. It was the way Tommy played like his life depended on it, because Ozzy recognized that desperation. He'd lived it, breathed it, nearly died from it. This wasn't a kid showing off. This was a kid fighting for his survival. Ozzy stepped out of the Mercedes and immediately felt the summer heat hit him like a wall. His hands were shaking, not from withdrawal this time, but from something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or recognition, the sense that he was witnessing something that mattered. The crowd around Tommy was small but growing. Tourists with cameras, local musicians who knew talent when they heard it. But they were all keeping their distance, like they understood they were witnessing something sacred. Tommy's technique wasn't perfect. How could it be? His guitar was held together with duct tape and prayers. His amp buzzed like an angry wasp, but the soul in his playing was flawless. It was the kind of raw, honest emotion that record companies spent millions trying to manufacture and never quite captured. Ozzy found himself thinking about his own childhood, practicing in his mother's kitchen until his fingers bled, playing air guitar to Black Sabbath records while his father screamed about wasted electricity. The hunger that had driven him to audition for a band called Earth, never dreaming they'd become the godfathers of heavy metal. When had he lost that hunger? When had music become a business instead of a lifeline? As Tommy reached the song's climax, Ozzy made a decision that would change both their lives forever. But it wasn't the decision people think it was. See, everyone assumes Ozzy approached Tommy because he was impressed by his talent. That's only half true. The real reason was darker, more complicated. Ozzy saw himself in that kid, not the successful version, but the desperate version. The version who would have done anything, sacrificed anyone to make it. And Ozzy knew exactly where that path led. Tommy finished the song to enthusiastic applause, his face flushed with exertion and adrenaline. He opened his eyes and began tuning his guitar for the next number, completely unaware that his hero was standing 15 feet away. That's when their eyes met. Tommy's hands froze on the guitar neck. His mouth fell open. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. "That was bloody brilliant, mate," Ozzy said, stepping forward through the crowd. His Birmingham accent was thicker when he was emotional, a tell that few people knew. "Absolutely fantastic. How long have you been playing?" Tommy's voice came out as barely a whisper. "About 3 years, sir. I honestly can't believe you're actually here." "Well, I am here," Ozzy replied, crouching down to Tommy's level. "And I've got to tell you, you've got real talent. That's not an easy song to play, especially on." He glanced at Tommy's battered equipment. "Well, let's just say you're making the most of what you've got, and that's what real musicians do." The crowd was growing larger now. Phones appeared. Cameras started rolling. But Ozzy kept his focus on Tommy because he recognized something in the kid's eyes that terrified him. It was the same look Ozzy had seen in his own reflection 30 years ago. The look of someone who would sell their soul for a chance at stardom. "Do you know any other songs from my catalog?" Ozzy asked. "Any other Sabbath or solo material?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "I know most of your solo stuff and quite a bit of Black Sabbath too. I've been working really hard on Mr. Crowley, but the keyboard parts are challenging to adapt." Most kids Tommy's age didn't even know Mr. Crowley existed. This kid had been studying Ozzy's entire catalog like a religious text. "Tell you what," Ozzy said, his voice carrying a tone of spontaneous inspiration that was actually calculated desperation. "How about we do Crazy Train together? I'll handle the vocals. You take care of that impressive guitar work." The crowd erupted. Tommy looked around at all the faces, all the cameras, all the expectations. This was his moment, his grandfather's prophecy coming true, his ticket to the conservatory, to success, to everything he'd ever dreamed of. What Tommy didn't know was that Ozzy was using him. Not maliciously, but using him nonetheless. Because 30 minutes earlier, Ozzy's career had been declared dead by a teenager in a boardroom. And now, performing with this talented kid, being filmed by dozens of phones, Ozzy saw a chance to prove that rock and roll wasn't dead. He was going to use Tommy's innocence to resurrect his own career. "Really?" Tommy asked. "You really want to perform together?" "Really," Ozzy confirmed. "But I've got one condition. Promise me you'll keep practicing, keep playing, keep following your passion no matter what obstacles you face." What Ozzy didn't say was the rest of that promise. The part about how following that passion might cost Tommy everything he held dear. How fame was a drug that felt like salvation but destroyed everything it touched. How the industry would chew up a 12-year-old kid and spit out the bones. "Deal," Tommy said without hesitation. As they began to play together, Ozzy felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pure, unbridled joy in making music. But underneath that joy was a growing sense of dread, because he knew what happened next in this story. He'd lived it. And as the cameras rolled and the crowd cheered, Ozzy realized he'd just made a terrible mistake. He hadn't saved Tommy Chen. He'd thrown him to the wolves. The performance was magical. The crowd was electric. The video would go viral within hours. But what nobody filming that moment knew was that Tommy's parents had just arrived at the edge of the crowd, and they weren't smiling. Tommy's mother spoke in Korean. 3 words hissed through clenched teeth that translated roughly to "You are dead." But that confrontation was still 20 minutes away. First came the business card, the moment that would haunt the Chen family for months. Because when Ozzy Osbourne pressed that small piece of cardstock into Tommy's palm, he wasn't just giving him a phone number. He was handing him a loaded gun. "Call my manager next week," Ozzy had said, his voice barely audible over the cheering crowd. "Not tomorrow, you need time to process this, but next week. We need to talk about getting you some proper equipment and maybe some real opportunities." Tommy had clutched that card like it was made of gold. His ticket to everything. The conservatory, professional equipment. A real chance. What he didn't know was that Ozzy's manager, Richard Steinberg, was the kind of man who saw dollar signs where other people saw children. And Steinberg had been watching the whole performance from his own black sedan, parked across the street. The video went viral in 4 hours. By midnight, it had 2 million views. By morning, it was on every music blog, entertainment website, and social media platform on Earth. Kid shreds Crazy Train with Ozzy. Street musician gets life-changing duet. The moment that restored faith in rock and roll. But viral fame is like a flood. It doesn't discriminate between what should be swept away and what should be saved. The Chen family's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. the next day. Record labels, talent agencies, TV producers who wanted Tommy on morning shows, reporters demanding interviews, strangers who somehow got their number and wanted to offer opportunities. Tommy's father answered the first few calls with confused politeness. By the 10th call, he'd unplugged the phone entirely. "This is not what we came to America for," his father said in Korean, packing their small living room while Tommy sat silent on the couch, still clutching Ozzy's business card. "We came here so you could be doctor, engineer, something respectable, not this circus." Tommy's mother was crying, not the happy tears you'd expect from a parent whose child just met their hero. These were tears of fear, of a woman who recognized that their carefully controlled life had just spiraled completely out of their hands. "Do you know what they're saying about us online?" she asked, switching to English so Tommy would understand. "They're calling us stage parents, saying we put you on that corner to get famous, that we're using you." Tommy looked confused. "But I chose to play there. I needed the money for—" "For what?" his father interrupted. "For what, Tommy?" And that's when Tommy made his second terrible mistake. He told them about the conservatory application, about the $300 fee he'd been trying to save for, about the deadline he'd been racing to meet. The silence that followed was deafening. His parents had spent 8 years sacrificing everything so Tommy could have a normal American childhood. His father worked 16-hour days at jobs that destroyed his back and his pride. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families who treated her like furniture. Also, Tommy could focus on school, get good grades, and build a stable, respectable life. And their son had been secretly planning to throw it all away for music. "You lied to us," his mother whispered. "All this time you've been lying to us." But the real devastation came 2 days later, when Richard Steinberg called. Tommy had waited exactly 1 week, just like Ozzy had told him. He'd practiced the conversation in his head 100 times. He'd imagined discussing musical development, mentorship, maybe some studio time. What he got instead was a predator who'd been circling since the video went viral. "Tommy, my boy," Steinberg's voice boomed through the phone. "You're a star, do you know that? A genuine, honest-to-God star." "I just want to learn," Tommy said quietly. "Mr. Osbourne said maybe you could help with equipment or lessons or—" "Lessons?" Steinberg laughed. "Kid, you're past lessons. You're ready for the big time. I've got 3 record labels interested. Disney wants to meet you. There's talk of a Christmas special, maybe a Saturday morning cartoon. We're looking at millions, Tommy, millions." Tommy felt his stomach drop. This wasn't what Ozzy had promised. This wasn't mentorship or gradual development. This was something else entirely. "I'm only 12, Tommy said. "Exactly, that's your angle. The 12-year-old who rocks with Ozzy. We'll get you a band, some backing musicians, polish up your image a bit. Maybe tone down the Korean thing, make you more mainstream American, you know." Tommy hung up. But Steinberg wasn't done. He started showing up at Tommy's school, calling their apartment at all hours, sending contracts and promotional materials. He even approached Tommy's parents directly, promising them wealth beyond their dreams if they'd just sign on the dotted line. Tommy's father read through one of Steinberg's contracts with the help of a lawyer friend. The terms were devastating. Tommy would owe the management company 70% of everything he earned for the next 10 years. They would control his image, his music, even his personal relationships. He would essentially become their property. "Over my dead body," his father said, tearing up the contract. But the damage was already done. Tommy's school life became unbearable. Kids who'd never noticed him before were suddenly his best friends, asking for autographs and selfies. Teachers treated him differently, like he was no longer a regular student. The principal called his parents for a meeting about managing Tommy's celebrity status. At home, the phone calls continued. Reporters camped outside their apartment building. Their neighbors started complaining about the disruption. The landlord mentioned that their lease was up for renewal soon, and all this media attention might be a problem. Remember those 47 days until eviction? They were down to 23. But the worst part wasn't the external pressure. It was watching his family fall apart from the inside. His parents started fighting about whether they'd made the right decision coming to America. His little sister couldn't understand why strangers were taking pictures of their building. The financial pressure that had driven Tommy to that corner in the first place was getting worse, not better, because all the attention was making it impossible for his father to find steady work. 3 weeks after the duet, Tommy made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He took Ozzy's guitar pick, the one he'd treasured since that magical afternoon, and announced on a live stream that he was done with music. But what happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Because as Tommy raised that guitar pick above his head, ready to destroy the symbol of his shattered dreams, a familiar voice spoke from behind the camera. "Before you do that, kid, maybe you should hear what I've been trying to tell you." It was Ozzy Osbourne, standing in Tommy's bedroom at 11 p.m. on a school night, having somehow gotten past security, past Tommy's parents, past every barrier that should have kept the Prince of Darkness away from a 12-year-old boy who just declared war on his own future. And the look in Ozzy's eyes suggested that everything Tommy thought he knew about that day on Hollywood Boulevard was about to change forever. "I've been trying to fire Richard Steinberg for 3 weeks, Ozzy said quietly, closing Tommy's bedroom door behind him. "But he won't take my calls." Tommy lowered the guitar pick, confusion replacing rage on his face. "What are you talking about?" "That manager I told you to call? He's not my manager anymore. Hasn't been for 2 months. I fired him the day after our performance when I found out what he was planning to do to you." Ozzy sat heavily on Tommy's desk chair, suddenly looking every one of his 56 years. "See, Tommy, there's something about that day on Hollywood Boulevard that nobody knows, something I should have told you from the beginning." But even that wasn't the whole truth, because what Ozzy was about to reveal would reframe everything, not just about their encounter, but about the very nature of dreams, sacrifice, and what it really means to save someone. Tommy sat on his bed, still clutching the guitar pick, waiting. "I didn't stop to listen to you because you were talented," Ozzy began. "I mean, you are talented, incredibly so, but that's not why I got out of that car." He paused, looking around Tommy's small room, at the posters of rock legends, at the homework scattered on the desk, at the childhood that fame was threatening to destroy. I stopped because I heard myself, 35 years ago, playing on a street corner in Birmingham, desperate and hungry, and convinced that music was my only way out. Ozzy's voice cracked slightly. And I remembered what happened to that kid. What happened next was the most honest conversation about fame that Tommy would ever hear. Ozzy told him about the contracts that looked like salvation but were actually chains, about the managers who promised the world and delivered slavery, about the way success could poison everything you touched, your relationships, your family, your sense of who you really were. When I gave you that business card, Ozzy continued, I thought I was helping. But the moment I saw Steinberg's car across the street, the moment I realized he'd been watching, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. So you've been trying to protect me? Tommy asked. I've been trying to undo the damage I caused. Do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks while Steinberg was harassing your family? Tommy shook his head. I've been destroying him, calling every contact I have in the industry, warning every label, every promoter, every venue owner about what kind of man Richard Steinberg really is, making sure that when his current contracts expire, nobody in this town will work with him again. But that still wasn't the whole story, because Ozzy's crusade against Steinberg had come at a price that Tommy was only now beginning to understand. The album I was working on, the one that was supposed to save my career, I walked away from it, told the label I wouldn't record another note until they blacklisted Steinberg industry-wide. Tommy's eyes widened. But your career is over, Ozzy said simply. Officially ended yesterday when the label dropped me. 35 years of rock and roll, finished because I couldn't let them destroy another kid the way they destroyed me. The silence in that small bedroom was deafening. Tommy realized he was holding his breath. So the crying, Tommy whispered, understanding flooding his face. In your car that day, you weren't celebrating my talent, you were mourning your own childhood. Ozzy nodded. I saw myself in you, kid, but not the successful version, the scared version, the version who didn't know that getting everything you want can cost you everything you are. But even this revelation wasn't the final twist, because Tommy was about to learn something about sacrifice that would change how he saw the world forever. There's one more thing, Ozzy said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope. Remember when I asked you to promise to keep playing no matter what obstacles you faced? Tommy nodded. Well, here's me keeping a promise too. Ozzy handed him the envelope. $300 for your conservatory application. Tommy stared at the envelope in shock. How did you know about that? Because I've been watching over you this whole time, making sure you were okay, making sure the vultures stayed away. And when I found out why you were really playing on that corner, Ozzy's voice grew thick with emotion. Let's just say your grandfather wasn't the only one who believed you were going to be something special. Tommy opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was exactly $300 and a letter of recommendation to the Los Angeles Youth Conservatory signed by Ozzy Osbourne himself. But there's a condition, Ozzy said. You disappear from the public eye, no interviews, no social media, no more viral videos. You get to be a normal kid who goes to music school and learns his craft the right way without the whole world watching. What about the conservatory? Won't they wonder why Ozzy Osbourne is recommending some random kid? Ozzy smiled for the first time that night. Random kid? Tommy, do you know how many conservatory applications I get asked to recommend every year? Hundreds. Rich kids whose parents think my endorsement will buy their way in. But I've never written a single one until now. The weight of this hit Tommy like a physical blow. Ozzy hadn't just sacrificed his career to protect him. He'd broken his own rules about endorsements, about staying out of music education politics, about the careful boundaries he'd built around his personal involvement with young musicians. Why, Tommy asked, why would you give up everything for someone you barely know? Because someone should have done it for me, Ozzy replied. Because maybe if one kid gets to grow up with his dreams intact instead of being devoured by them, then all the rest of this nightmare will have been worth something. Tommy looked down at the guitar pick in his hand, the symbol he'd been ready to destroy out of rage and disappointment. Now it represented something entirely different. Your grandfather was right, Ozzy said, standing up to leave. Someone did hear you, but the real magic wasn't in getting discovered. It was in finding someone who cared enough to make sure you didn't lose yourself in the process. 6 months later, Tommy Chen was accepted to the Los Angeles Youth Conservatory. The acceptance letter made no mention of Ozzy Osbourne's recommendation. Tommy's viral video was quietly removed from social media platforms. Richard Steinberg's management company went bankrupt, and he left the music industry entirely. And every July 15th, Tommy returns to that same corner on Hollywood Boulevard, not to recreate the magic of that famous day, but to honor the sacrifice that nobody ever saw. He plays Crazy Train for anyone who stops to listen, carrying with him the guitar pick that represents not the moment his dreams came true, but the moment someone loved him enough to make sure those dreams wouldn't destroy him. The corner now has a small plaque, but it doesn't commemorate the day Tommy met Ozzy Osbourne. It honors the day the Prince of Darkness chose to save a child's soul instead of resurrecting his own career. Because sometimes the greatest gift isn't getting what you want. It's being protected by someone who knows what that wanting can cost. Tommy Chen never became a household name, and that was exactly the point. Today he's a successful session musician who credits everything to a man who gave up his comeback to keep him human. In a world that devours child stars for entertainment, maybe the real heroes aren't the ones who make kids famous, but the ones who make sure they survive their talent. What would you choose? Instant fame that might destroy your family, or a quiet chance to grow into who you're meant to become?